In 55 BC, after the pacification of the Armorican tribes in the northwest, a new enemy presented itself that threatened the entirety of Gaul and the Roman world beyond. Two German tribes, the Usepides and the Tencteri, crossed the Rhine and invaded the lands of the Belgae, bringing hundreds of thousands of barbarians along with them. This was the second time in a 4-year span that a German disaster would have to be prevented by Caesar and his noble legions. But this time, Caesar wasn't willing to settle with a single victory over the invaders. He wanted to make sure something like this would never happen again. So began the very first crossing of the Rhine by the Roman Republic. And before we get started, if you like these kinds of videos, please make sure to like and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel and allows me to keep making content about the history and glory of the Roman Republic. It's important to underscore the true threat that the Germanic menace posed to the civilized West. It is often argued, wrongly, that the Germans, and Gauls for that matter, didn't do anything wrong. One might say they were good boys, who only sought to find greener pastures after their land had been despoiled and destroyed by, well, other Germans. Stepping out of the Gallic War for a moment, I'm going to turn to Plutarch and his record of the end of the Cimbrian War, a war which was actually won by the great leadership of Caesar's uncle, Gaius Marius. Plutarch says the following: "In this engagement, the greater part of the enemy and their best warriors were cut to pieces. For in order to preserve an unbroken line, those who were fighting in the front ranks were fastened together by long chains, which were passed through their belts. Those who fled were driven back to their fortifications by the Romans, who then were confronted by a most appalling sight. For the women, all dressed in black, stood on the wagons and killed the fugitives, their husbands, their brothers, their fathers. Then they strangled their little children with their own hands, hurling them down under the wheels of the wagons or the feet of the animals. And finally, they cut their own throats. There was one woman, they say, who hung herself from the end of a wagon pole with a child dangling from each ankle, and the men, for lack of trees, tied themselves by the neck to the horns or feet of the oxen, and then drove the animals forward with goads, so that they were either dragged or trampled to death. Yet in spite of the mass suicide, more than 60,000 prisoners were taken. Twice as many as this were said to have been killed. No passage better quantifies the savagery of the Germans. They were a foe for whom defeat meant annihilation. A people with so little value of life that they would sooner cut the throats of their own children than suffer a life lived under the shame of defeat. When Caesar fought the Germans, he was not fighting an ordinary people like you might imagine, but the most savage, the most brutal, and the most cunning of all the barbarians. After the defeat of the Teutonus and Usepides, Caesar knew that extreme measures had to be taken to prevent a greater tide of barbarians from crossing the Rhine and destabilizing Gaul in the future. So, he devised a plan to bridge the river and invade the German heartland. Caesar outlines his primary reasons for invading Germany as follows. First, and most compelling, Caesar had seen how easily the Germans were induced to invade Gaul. He wanted them to experience fear on their own account, when they realized that the army of the Roman people was both capable of crossing the Rhine and brave enough to venture it. Second, a large contingent of cavalry from the Usepides and Tencteri had retreated over the Rhine into the territory of the Sugambri, with whom they had struck an alliance which was hostile to Gaul. Third, a friendly German tribe, the Ubii, had sent envoys to Caesar seeking a treaty of friendship and also a request for aid, as they were under attack by the Suebi, the tribe of Ariovistus, who was also the tribe responsible for pushing the Usepites and Tencteri out of their ancestral lands. With these objectives in mind, Caesar declined an offer by the Ubii to transport his army across the Rhine by boat, and instead chose to erect a bridge at an appropriate spot for the crossing. Caesar goes into great detail about the construction process, but suffice it to say that the bridge was completed in less than 10 days' time, after which Caesar set up forts on both banks. Caesar first sought to attack the Sugambri, but the cowards had fled to isolated areas of the deep forest, and Caesar had to content himself with setting fire to their settlements and cutting down the corn. Next, to fulfill his promise to the Ubii, he set out for their lands, where he discovered that the Suebi had lifted their assault and retreated into the woods, where they were waiting for the arrival of the Romans. During this time, other Germanic tribes approached him with offers of friendship, which he accepted. Caesar, however, saw no reason to chase the Germans into the forest, so after just 18 days spent on the offensive, Caesar judged that he had accomplished the objectives he had set out for himself. He took the legions back into Gaul and destroyed the bridge, thus bringing the Germanic campaign to a close. While some have argued that Caesar's crossing of the Rhine was just a publicity stunt to increase his prestige back in Rome, I find this difficult to believe. The war against the Usepites and Tencteri, while short, had shown Caesar just how susceptible Gaul was to Germanic influence. Not only had they crossed the Rhine in enormous numbers and displaced several tribes, but other Gauls, being eager for political change and war, immediately sent envoys to the Germans and began allying themselves with their interest. It was clear now that especially amongst the Belgae, who were themselves largely of Germanic stock, that trusting such a people to act in good faith was not only foolhardy, but dangerous. And this fear of betrayal would manifest itself just 1 year later with the deception of Ambiorix and the annihilation of the Roman legions under Cotta and Sabinus. So while crossing the Rhine certainly did make Caesar famous back at home, I do not believe that this was a secondary or even tertiary reason for him taking these actions. The German tribes were a real threat, and having now twice defended Gaul from their aggression, Caesar seized upon an opportunity to ensure that the Germans would have to play the part of the defender. This decision worked, and the only Germanic involvements in Gaul after this point in the war were either by Caesar's invitation to supplement his cavalry, or by Belgic tribes in order to bolster their forces during their short-lived rebellion. Thank you for watching this video. If you made it to the end, please leave a comment below and let me know what you think about Caesar's actions against the Germans during the war, and how you think it affected the later policies of the Roman Empire.